1882年，美国国会通过了历史上著名的排华法案。当时这个法案几乎禁止了所有华人移民到美国，即使是已经移民来美的华人，也无法获得公民身份和权利。此法案于1943年被废除，直到2012年6月18号，美国国会正式为此对曾经针对华人移民的歧视性法案作出道歉。
So if government can discriminate against Chinese people, then white people could do anything against Chinese, and that's exactly what they did.
从1882年的排华法案到2020年的反亚裔仇恨犯罪不断激增，华裔美国人的目前处境到底如何？而针对亚裔的仇恨又从何而来？大家好，欢迎收看《仇恨边缘》，我是主持人张欣毅。今天天下卫视请到 Stop AAPI Hate 创始人张华耀一起来聊一聊亚裔美国人的过去、现状和未来，和他作为第5代华裔移民和大学教授对于亚裔仇恨的看法。Hi, Dr. Jeung. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming to our show.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So most of people know you because you launched Stop AAPI Hate back in March 2020. But besides that, you're also a professor at San Francisco State University and teaching Asian American studies, right? So what else should we know about you? Could you do a little bit introduction?
Oh, sure. I grew up here in San Francisco. My family's been in California for 5 generations, and actually the fun fact about San Francisco State, my parents met at San Francisco State and then had kids like me.
So Dr. Jeung, what motivated you to establish Stop AAPI Hate, this organization?
In early 2020, when I heard about COVID-19 in China and how deadly it was, I was really concerned because we knew it would come to the United States. And I recalled SARS in 2003, where people were scared about that disease, and then they would blame Asians and attack Asians. And so I thought, history could repeat itself. And so tracking that and seeing that it was on the rise in the United States, I began to work with 2 other community partners, Chinese for Affirmative Action and the AAPI Equity Alliance in Los Angeles. And we began to organize and try to get California government to pay attention to this rise in racism. When the government said they didn't have the capacity, we created our own website, asked people just to report their own experiences, their own stories of how they were being attacked, harassed. We launched in March 2020 on a website in multiple languages and Asian languages.
So are you saying that this organization website never existed before, like nobody was paying attention about anti-Asian hate until 2020?
There were some sites that collected anti-Asian violence data, but not the current spate of COVID-related data. We knew that there were specific ways that Asians were getting mistreated, like they were being shunned, or we were being spat upon. Most data collection is on hate crimes, so you have to be arrested for data to be collected, and that's the government's responsibility. But nobody was collecting the data that we were tracking, which was, again, the types of experiences that Asians were experiencing because of COVID-19. They reported not because they wanted to punish the perpetrator or to get resources. They wanted to amplify the community voice. They wanted the racism to stop. They knew that we would represent them well, and so that's why they report to us and not to the government, because they feel like, well, the government can't do anything about someone yelling at me, but maybe Stop AAPI Hate could share our story so that we could address the broader issues that cause racism.
But pandemic just happened since 2020. And this anti-Asian hate started a long time ago,
right?
Back in 1882?
Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, so in the 19th century, the yellow peril stereotype was invoked in a lot of magazines and popular representations, right? Yeah. There's pictures of Chinese eating rats, or pictures of Chinese overcoming the United States with their masses of people. So that stereotype back then, the fear that Chinese brought leprosy, malaria, smallpox, that was all legitimation for the Chinese Exclusion Act, a policy. It also justified violence against Chinese. So over 200 Chinese communities were actually forcibly driven out in the 19th century. Today, the stereotype that there's a Chinese virus, that Chinese are the ones who carry the virus, that's led to countless attacks against Asians and, policies that hurt Chinese. Trump tried to ban WeChat. He banned Chinese scientists and researchers. He cut migration. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas. All these policies were part of that yellow peril that sees Chinese people as threats.
In 2021, the Atlanta spot shooting case, a white man shot 8 people and 6 were Asian women. And the perpetrator claimed himself as Asian fetish, and his motivation is from sexual urges rather than racial bias. So in your study, does fetish belong to racism and why?
So in this case, and for a lot of women especially, race and racism and sex and sexism are connected. And so the way Asian women are portrayed in media is that they're often seen as prostitutes or China dolls who are supposed to be submissive to white men. Again, the combination of both their race as being Asian and their gender of being women get combined to develop a stereotype about them, right? And so for the Atlanta shooter, he says he had a sex addiction. He could have gone anywhere, right, if he wanted to address that. But instead, he drove miles out of his way to attack Asian businesses. And then he spent even more time to drive to another place to attack Asian women. We call it intersectional racism, that both race and gender combine to affect how people experience discrimination.
Yeah, I see. 好，我们休息片刻，广告之后马上回来。欢迎回到仇恨边缘，让我们继续和 Stop AAPI Hate 联合创始人张华耀一起探讨华裔美国人的过去和现状。Okay, Dr. Zhang, so you are 5th generation of Asian American. Wow, so can I understand your family history could be a microcosm of American history?
That's true. So my great-great-grandparents came in 1868, and each generation experienced, so, all the bad things that happened to Asians throughout history are negative things that my family experienced and have been traumatized by. And all the opportunities and hopes and privileges that we've received, my family's also benefited from.
Okay, so we're about to see a PowerPoint. In the first slide, you wrote, the personal is political and the political is personal. Could you explain what that means?
Yeah, that's a feminist adage that means that what happens politically, the policies made by the United States, the racial politics in terms of how Asians are treated, the international politics, U.S.-China relations, all those policies and politics really impact us on a personal level, on a very individual and family level. And then what we do as a family member, what we do in our interpersonal relations, then can also be seen as political acts of power. How we act, how we vote, how we spend our money can also be political acts. And so what we do as individuals can make real change societally.
Yeah. What's your personal experience from growing up in America as an Asian kid?
Let me just tell you my father's experience, right? And then how policies affected him. Okay, so the first example of how policies affect people personally was the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, the U.S. Congress passed a law that said Chinese no longer could migrate. And that law really impacted my great-grandparents because then they couldn't bring other family members, right? And so they're isolated in the United States. It's sad because they really couldn't go back to China, go back and forth. They were pretty much cut off from relationships in China. So that impacted them personally. That law, again, justified further violence against Asians and Chinese. So if government can discriminate against Chinese people, if government creates policies where Chinese can't testify against white people in courts, then white people could do anything against Chinese, and that's exactly what they did. My great-grandparents were living in Monterey, California, and they got evicted. Their entire community got evicted. When the Chinese wouldn't leave, the landlord told his property manager, do anything you can to get rid of them. And so the next week, a fire burned down the entire village. Over 200 people got displaced. The landlord then put a fence around the village, stationed armed guards so the Chinese couldn't return. And so my poor great-grandparents, they lived there for 4 decades, raised a family, built a home, had a thriving business. They lost everything in that fire, and they had to move to San Francisco Chinatown. So again, that policy legitimated violence. That violence affected us very personally in that they had to move to San Francisco Chinatown. And so it took my family 2 generations to become property owners again. My grandfather was an American citizen, right? He was born in the US. Yet when he wanted to bring his bride from Hong Kong, no one believed that he was an American citizen. Even if his parents testified, yeah, he was born in America, nobody believed him. So he had to get 3 white witnesses to testify, oh yeah, we remember him as a baby in Monterey.
Wow.
Still, again, the policy was, we don't believe Chinese. Again, we were assumed to be disease carriers, we were assumed to be illegal aliens. And so, on Angel Island, the policy was that you had to go through a lengthy interrogation, you had to have a medical checkup. Europeans coming, they get processed in 3 hours. Chinese face mass detention, right? They were locked up for weeks because they were seen as illegal or disease-ridden. So my grandfather, my grandmother, after getting white witnesses to prove he was a citizen, they still had to answer 56 questions and be totally aligned, totally in sync, or else they'll deport my grandmother back, right? So those policies hurt us. It shaped where my family lived, it shaped whether my grandparents could get married. And then moving down, my father faced segregation. He had to live in Chinatown, couldn't get out of Chinatown. Oftentimes in the 40s and 50s, most people grew up in Chinatown said if they left Chinatown, they would get attacked, they would get beaten up, they would be bullied, especially if they were kids. And so they just stayed in their small Chinese community. But fortunately, a different policy really benefited my father, the GI Bill. And so he was able to go to college, he was able to get a home loan, and that was how we were able to become homeowners and move to the middle class. So again, policy affects us detrimentally and negatively, but policy could also help Chinese and Asian Americans.
Yeah. So when you grow up, do you experience anything specific that make you unforgettable?
Yeah, well, so I grew up in the 70s, and back then school busing was the policy, that students were to be integrated, that they wanted to mix up white kids with Chinese kids with black kids. And so because one school didn't have enough Chinese representatives, I had to take a bus to go all the way to a different school, right? Not my neighborhood school. I used to go to Chinese school to learn how to speak Chinese and read and write, but because I was bused, I didn't return in time to go to Chinese school. So ironically, because I was so busy being a Chinese for these white kids, I never learned how to speak Chinese myself.
Wow, so do you feel like you've been used?
Yeah, I went to 4 different elementary schools. I never moved, but they kept on busing me all around just to be a token Chinese kid and, bring noodles for multicultural festivals.
Oh my God.
But it is really superficial. So, yeah, that type of policy, Vice President Kamala Harris said she was a poor black kid who was bused when she was growing up, and I was like the poor Chinese boy who was bused. And especially my students, how policies impact Asians a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Who we could marry, where we could live, where we could go to school, what kind of work we do, they're all shaped by these policies. So it's really important for us to get involved at the political and policy level.
好，让我们休息片刻，然后继续回来聊一聊如何停止这场仇恨。欢迎回到仇恨边缘，让我们一起来听一听政策的改变如何影响亚裔美国人的方方面面。 So, Dr. Jeung, what kind of policy you are hoping to see in the future?
So we at Stop AAPI Hate, we want to address racism comprehensively and for the long term, right? We don't want these Band-Aid solutions, but instead we want to prevent the racism before it occurs. So we have three issue areas that we're going to focus on, and the first is education, right? People don't realize this, but now 19 states have passed or have pending legislation for Asian American stories to be taught in the schools. This is a huge movement. It's in response to the rise in racism. People realize, wow, Asians are getting attacked. 1 out of 3 parents say their kids are being bullied, Asian American kids. And so to address that bullying, to stop the violence, we want to educate other kids about Asian American. And in California, we passed that requirement, and we're going to make sure it's implemented well, that teachers know how to teach about Chinese people and about Asian people. Secondly, we want to expand civil rights. You know, again, most of the racism we're experiencing aren't crimes, but they're violations of our civil rights. So if you get harassed at a store and you can't shop, you're denied what we call public accommodations. You're denied safe access to goods and services. That's a violation. But Asian people, we don't realize this, we don't know about our rights, and so we're trying to encourage the government to better educate our community, better protect us, so that when we do report, we can get translators, we can get redress. And so we, just this week, the State Assembly passed 2 of our bills sponsored by Stop AAPI Hate to address this harassment and to provide us more civil rights.
Oh, that's good.
And thirdly, we want to, you know, again, there's a lot of violence. Our elders are really fearful, right? And so we want to promote more community safety. We want to have everybody have a sense of well-being. And so we got California to pass a bill, the API Equity Budget Bill, to provide $156 million to address this type of neighborhood violence. And so we're going to continue to promote the funding of our communities, to provide victim services in language so that Chinese people, when they're attacked, they know where to go, how they can get help, that there'll be Chinese language resources available to them. So we're going to continue to try to promote community safety for all of us.
3 directions. So could you share a little bit about those 2 years under COVID that Stop AAPI Hate, this organization, collected data about these incidents?
Yeah, so our data has shown over the last 2 years, we've collected over 11,500 incidents. They range, again, from being physical assault, being spat and coughed upon, to being facing online racism, cyber racism. We experience a lot of harassment. And so there's a whole range of racism, but the bulk of it, 2/3 of the cases, are just being verbally assaulted. But you know, when people yell at us like, go back to China, even if we dismiss it or try to brush it off, it's still traumatizing.
Yeah.
That means 1 out of 5 of us who experience this type of verbal harassment, we actually can get diagnosed for trauma. And that official diagnosis is when you experience 3 or more symptoms of issues like anxiety, depression, anger, hypervigilance, where you're always looking out for yourself, or avoidance of places. So when people are attacked, even verbally, they experience 3 of those issues. And these are long-term issues. So a lot of us are experiencing trauma, and the rest of us, we experience vicarious trauma. That means when I see a grandmother being attacked on the street, I think about my own grandmother, right? And I think, that's attack on me too. Yeah. That's attack on my family. And that's why you see so many Asian Americans both angry and fearful, but also you see so many Chinese Americans standing up to the racism now. And despite the trauma and the anger I feel, I've been really encouraged to see the Chinese American community really stand up now, and the Asian American community really rise up to fight the racism.
So, Dr. Jeung, since you've been done some victim service, so what's your advice for the victim? What should they do after the incident?
Yeah, it's really, again, difficult to experience racism, to be attacked, and a lot of times people feel isolated and alone. So it's really important for you to seek support, to share the experience, because if you internalize it and you hold it by yourself, again, you're traumatized. That anger will just become resentment. The fear becomes anxiety. And so unless you, again, deal with your attack, you're not going to be able to heal and be able to move on well. So I think it's really important for people to get support from family and friends, first of all. And then if it's a crime, report to the police. If it's an incident, report to us, StopAAPIHate.org, just so that people know what's happening, so that people can track and address the issue. So please report it either to the police or to StopAAPIHate.org. In San Francisco and in LA, you could get resources, and especially if you're a victim of crime, we can provide language resources in Chinese-speaking people to know how to go through the process of filing a complaint, helping you go through the process. If you need medical or mental health support, we could provide that.
You mentioned that if it's a crime, call the police. If it's incident, report to Stop AAPI Hate. What's the difference?
If someone assaults you, attacks you, if you could arrest the person, then you should go to the police. But for other incidents, like people just spit on you or yell at you, police can't help you, so you should contact us.
I see. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeung. Thanks to our show. 好了，今天的节目就告一段落。仇恨边缘是一档聚焦反亚裔仇恨犯罪的访谈节目，我们今后还会请到更多的政客、专家以及教授一起来探讨仇恨犯罪。我们也希望这个节目被更多需要了解和需要帮助的人看到。让我们一起共同努力，把周围变成一个充满爱而不是恨的地方。我是主持人张歆艺，我们下期节目见。正在收看节目的你，如果有任何问题想要问我们的来宾，欢迎在评论区留言，我们会仔细查看每一条评论，并联系该嘉宾帮忙解答。让我们共同努力，为停止仇恨犯罪贡献一份力量。